Today's shipwreck video is a bit of an extra one, covering the wreck of USS Edsall, a ship best known for her last stand, where she embarrassed the best of the Japanese Navy. This was a brave ship that did not go down easily, and her captain, Joshua Nix, was one of the best ship handlers in Navy history. That said, all of this is material I've already covered in 2 different videos. I'll link both in the description as well. For today's video, we'll be looking at Edsall's wreck. This was, evidently, discovered last year, with the identity of the wreck only confirmed and publicly released at the start of last week. You can see why this is an extra video. I would normally wait for more material to be released before I cover a wreck. That's why I haven't covered Edsall's sister, USS Stewart. In this case, I'm making an exception. When Edsall's discovery was announced, it came with a mosaic. That mosaic of the wreck site has enough detail for a dedicated video to tell the final part of Edsall's story. Now, since I've covered that story in 2 different videos, I'll only briefly touch on it here. The end of USS Edsall came on March 1st, 1942, when the destroyer had the misfortune to run right into the Kido Butai, consisting of 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 4 aircraft carriers. As you could expect, Edsall was doomed. But she wouldn't go down easily. For nearly 2 hours, Edsall evaded every attempt to sink her. Nix would make excellent use of smokescreens and rain squalls, while turning and shifting his destroyer in ways that baffled Japanese gunners. One of Chikuma's crew described it best. This enemy ship was extremely maneuverable and repeated changing speeds and courses, and ran away like a Japanese dancing mouse. Edsall was only disabled, not by gunfire, but by aircraft. A reportedly furious Admiral Nagumo sent off dive bombers. Sources don't agree on which carrier's aircraft dealt the fatal blow. What matters here is that Edsall was left ablaze and dead in the water after hits from Japanese dive bombers. The Japanese closed in, blasting Edsall as she sank by the stern. The surviving crew abandoned ship at this point, with Lieutenant Commander Nix apparently returning to the bridge, never to be seen again. Although we can't be certain. Regardless, Edsall had sunk by 7 p.m. on March 1st, 1942, after embarrassing the best of the Japanese fleet. Unfortunately, only a handful of survivors were picked up, ranging from 8 to 11, depending on the source. What we know for sure is that 6 survivors eventually ended up on Celebes, where they would be executed by Japanese land forces. For decades after this, the actual fate of Edsall was completely unknown. It took a lot of digging through Japanese records and survivor accounts to put together her story. And even then, her exact sinking position was something of a mystery. Until last year, when the Australian Navy found the wreck while conducting a mission in the area, 200 miles east of Christmas Island, at a depth of 18,000 feet or 5,486 meters. Fortunately, that's too deep to worry about illegal salvage. The wreck they located was surprisingly intact, from the material we have. Edsall had burned badly, and this is reflected in much of the superstructure being missing. Other parts, such as the torpedo tubes, likely fell away when she capsized and sank. But despite the fire and the shelling, after she was disabled, Edsall is still in one piece. Mostly. Let's start with the sonar, which is interesting in its own right. I remember the petrol surveys and how impressive their sonar was. This is even better, aside from the artifacting on the wreck itself. The first thing that jumps out is probably the torpedo tubes. simply because they're so recognizable. There's two sets resting off the side of the wreck. As a Clemson-class destroyer, Edsall carried 4 of those mounts. 2 are missing, but the other 2 are seen here. First, this one, the closer one to the wreck, which landed upright. And then the other one, nearly off the screen here, which looks to be inverted. The base is visible at the center. And ahead of that, you can see the open end of the tubes from the bottom. Notably, there are no torpedoes. This would match with Japanese reports that Edsall fired off her torpedoes. Either way, let's move to the wreck itself now. Unfortunately, the jittery nature of the sonar here does obscure a lot of detail. Even so, there are a couple things to pick up on. First, that the wreck is in one piece, again mostly. Edsall hasn't broken in half or anything like that. The bow is recognizable here, and so is the stern here. That stern is actually in much rougher shape, as we'll see with the mosaic. As for the sonar, there's 3 more things to point out. First, the bridge here. You can't see detail, but the structure is still visible on the wreck. And that goes for the gunhouse as well, just behind the bridge. Unfortunately, the third note is that basically everything else is missing. There's none of the distinctive 4-stack funnels remaining. Edsall, past the gunhouse, is pretty much barren. Although this isn't surprising. Even ignoring how long she's been on the bottom, the destroyer capsized. And on top of that, she was ablaze before she went under. Neither of which are conducive to superstructure surviving. Regardless, that rounds things off for this sonar image. However, the US Embassy video included another different sonar image. Let's touch on that before moving to the mosaic. Only briefly though, because this one doesn't show much more detail. We do get a better look at the overall lines of the wreck, most notable at the stern, where the damage is far clearer. You can see where it broke off. The rest of the wreck, on the other hand, still isn't very clear. The torpedo tubes, however, are better seen here. Take this set, which is very clearly upside down. This was visible before, but it's much clearer now. You can also see how it's partially buried in the bottom, something that applies to the other set as well. Alternatively, the back half was blown off. It's hard to say. Either way, the last note on this sonar is this bit here in the corner. What it is, I'm not entirely sure. If anyone has an idea, by all means put it in the comments. That said, we've now finished off the sonar. So, onto the wreck itself. I'll start by putting up the full mosaic here, and then we can look at individual details. As for the mosaic, this is one of the more interesting looks at a wreck that I've ever seen. Very rarely do you see a wreck in this kind of detail. Close-in details, yes, but not the entire wreck in one go. Doing a photo mosaic like this is expensive and time-consuming, to say the least, but very worth it in the end from a naval archaeology perspective. For example, you can immediately tell the overall condition of the wreck. There's no guesswork here. Let's start with the most obvious thing, the damage to the stern. This is extensive, with a good part of the ship outright missing. Looking at a picture of the destroyer on the surface, it looks like Edsall broke around the aft end of her stern deckhouse. There's a davit on the deck here. On the surface, that davit was here, and the forward end of the deckhouse was here. It is, however, difficult to say with certainty exactly where the break was, because that deckhouse is gone, along with the gun fixed to it. There's a tiny remnant of it here, but nothing beyond that, aside from what looks like an outline where the structure was mounted. And the hull is also pretty badly crumpled in around this general area. This is quite a bit of damage, although not a surprising amount. Edsall sank by the stern, so that area was pretty heavily damaged. Moreover, the ship had, earlier in the war, dropped a depth charge at too shallow a depth. That had damaged the stern, with the damage never properly repaired. I wouldn't be surprised if that contributed to the wreck on the bottom. Regardless, as you move further ahead, the damage doesn't get much better. Edsall's hull looks better, at least from this angle. However, the superstructure is still gone. All that remains is scattered debris and that davit I mentioned earlier, along with holes in the deck. This appears to be where the deck rotted away, likely where the searchlight platform used to be mounted. To round off this area, we have what look like a couple shell holes here. However, I can't say that with 100% certainty, both because we don't have a close-in look, and because it's entirely possible that's just rusting. Now as we move further ahead, we're reaching the more intact parts of the wreck. There's still no sign of the distinctive smokestacks, but the forward gunhouse is more or less intact. The shape is clearly recognizable, and you can even see intact railing here. This area was probably less damaged during the sinking, so it survived better over the decades. With the most notable feature, obviously, being the pair of 4-inch guns, one trained ahead and the other trained out to the side. These were open mountings, so the crew was completely exposed to enemy fire. I wouldn't be surprised if the different orientation is a result of Nix's wild maneuvering, the crew shifting their weapons to fire back before abandoning the mounts in whatever position they ended up in, when the crew abandoned ship. In any case, both seem to be intact. The upper one is difficult to make out much detail on, but it seems fine. The lower one, meanwhile, still has much of the actual mounting in place. We can't see much detail from here, but the equipment is still there. However, there's not much else to say about this area beyond those guns. Most of the deck is covered in silt and obscured from view. The same goes for the side of the hull, aside from two things. First, the white paint. Asiatic fleet destroyers were painted bright white in peacetime, and as her wartime paint faded, this came back out on Edsall here. The second note is what looks like another shell hole here. I feel more confident in labeling it as a shell impact because of the rust pattern. You can see how the paint has faded in a neat circle. This matches up with identified shell impacts on other Pacific wrecks. And with that, there's only one other area left to look at: the bow and the bridge. Three things jump out here. The first one being the bow, which is buried almost all the way up to the deck. Edsall seems to have come down pretty hard. I don't think that's responsible for the missing stern, if only because of the lack of recognizable debris. But it did bury the bow, although the destroyer's sleek lines are still visible. The second thing, moving a bit further back, is the forward gun. This is still in place, but we can't make out much detail. Which brings us to the final part, in the form of the bridge. This has suffered some collapsing over the years. I would guess that's from the fire, although I can't rule out the idea of shell damage. Regardless, the overall structure is still there, and still recognizable, even if a large portion is missing here. It's sobering, I think, to imagine Nick standing on that crumpled bridge as his ship fought for her life. With that thought in mind, let's end things here, with two final pictures from the survey. I'll link the video these came from, of course, but for the moment, these two are what we have. First, a look at the side of the hull, where we can see the paint and the portholes. And second, a look at the deck gun, where we can see the mount in more detail. It seems a fitting image to end on. A stark reminder of how hard these men fought right up to the end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.